She did kind of defy convention by introducing a new way to examine animal behavior. And I don't think, her intention was to defy convention. I think she simply wanted to do the job that had been set for her, to understand chimpanzees.
She often spoke about how being perceived as a difficult woman is so easy, because any woman who doesn't do what is expected of her is often labeled a difficult woman.
Hello, this is In Focus and I am Anupama Chandrasekaran. Jane Goodall was just 26 years old when she first stepped into the forests of Gombe in Tanzania, Eastern Africa. She had switched careers from working as an assistant to the paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey to take on the extraordinary opportunity to study one of our closest relatives in the wild. Just with a notebook and binoculars slung over her shoulders, she stepped into a forest of towering mahogany and fig trees. Long-armed chimpanzees swung nimbly from branch to branch, hooting and calling to one another, while young chimps clung to their mothers, tumbling, learning to groom and play. Few humans had ever seen them this close. She watched them fish termites with sticks and grieve their dead, and she gave them names. Through her unorthodox fieldwork, she then achieved a rare feat at one of the world's most prestigious universities. She earned a PhD at Cambridge without an undergraduate degree, inspiring generations of women to follow their own path in science. On October 1st, 2025, Jane Goodall passed away at the age of 91 of natural causes while on a speaking tour in the United States. So, what is it about her life that still moves and inspires us? To reflect on that, I am joined by primatologist Catherine Crockford from the French National Center for Scientific Research at Lyon, France, and Neha Sinha, wildlife biologist, conservationist, and author. And Neha is based in Delhi, India. Welcome to In Focus.
Thank you so much for having me. Great pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much.
Catherine, we've had a chance to speak before, and of course, every scientist has an origin story, a moment of curiosity that turns into a vocation. You, of course, had been inspired by Jane Goodall and actually packed your bags and went to West Africa to study primates. Now, can you tell us what age was that and what was it that sparked this interest in you?
When I was in my 20s, I read her books, and she writes with the immediacy with which she engages with people when she talks directly, that it makes you feel like you are sitting there with her observing the chimpanzees as she's describing it in her books. And this really opened my interest in our evolutionary roots. The way that she describes chimpanzees, there's so many parallels with humans, and that I find that very intriguing. So after reading her books, I put on my boots, binoculars, and went into the jungle, and now have a career studying chimpanzee behavior in West Africa.
Is there any particular story that you remember from her books? Because like you said, she had a way of describing her work and her observations in a very vivid way. Is there something that stays in your mind's eye that you remember, vividly, that was something that you read that kind of played in your mind?
Particularly her descriptions of chimpanzee communication. So especially also in her science book that came out in 1986, The Chimpanzees of the Gombe Stream, where she details this very intricate vocal repertoire and gestural repertoire. And so there was still a lot to unpick there about what's really going on in their communication. And I was very intrigued and wanted to try and understand chimpanzee conversations. And that's what I've gone on to research.
Yeah, and I think this is something she always did, even when she started her speeches and, any kind of conference she went to, she always kind of hooted, right? And she kind of made those vocalizations to kind of intrigue people, to interest them, and to kind of, poke their curiosity about how these primates actually kind of communicated to each other. I remember seeing a video of hers with Prince Harry, And she was kind of chiding him and asking him, do you remember I've taught you this before? And doing the hooting call, and I think patting of the head, which is also something very common way of greeting among the chimpanzees.
So I have had the honor of pantooting with Jane in the past, which is, a wonderful moment.
Of saying hello, right? In a language that both of you understand.
Pantoot is more about, we think it now, really encodes individual identity. So we think it's about, indicating it's me, I'm here.
This, Jane, in the 1960s, women in science were very few. Jane, alongside Dian Fossey and Biruté Galdikas. Now, Dian Fossey, of course, studied gorillas, and Biruté Galdikas studied orangutans. They stepped into the forest and claimed a space that had kind of been closed for women for a very, very long time. In fact, they were called the primates. They kind of made it possible for other women to follow. Now, how did these stories shape your own path as a woman and primatologist? And I know you've touched upon this earlier as well, but, if you want to go a little more into details.
The scientists at the time gave her the feeling that her approach was wrong, because she, for example, gave the chimpanzees names that she allowed to think of them as personalities, which at the time was considered unscientific. So she did kind of defy convention by introducing a new way to examine animal behavior. And I don't think, her intention was to defy convention. I think she simply wanted to do the job that had been set for her, to understand chimpanzees. Science is about unearthing truths about the world and how it works. And I think it quickly became apparent to her that conventional approaches were not going to enable her to understand the complexities of chimpanzee societies.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere, or I heard her speak somewhere, where she said that she probably would not have been able to do the research that she did if she had numbered the chimps, as was the scientific convention back then. She kind of said that she was able to do what she did because she had names, like David Graeber, to this silver-bearded chimpanzee that she was very fond of. And
Yes.
That was quite interesting to hear her say that.
Yes, exactly. And I think now that we have quantitative data, we've been able to update, the methods that we use in the last 65 years in studying behavior. And we see that a lot of those ideas that she put forward really, really stand the test of time and stand up to new analyses. So she really identified something that had been missed before.
For somebody who is unfamiliar with Jane's legacy, could you kind of give us a short kind of understanding of who she was and what she did, so that anybody who's listening to this conversation has better context?
Yes, well, she started out observing chimpanzees, but she did so without a scientific background. And then she went on to be given a PhD nonetheless from Cambridge University, as you mentioned. But because her approach was not well received, at least partly because of that, she realized that she has this incredible gift to inspire people and pass on her passion for animals and her understanding for animals, that I think she moved then into more conservation, which was also incredibly important, and activism to raise awareness for the plight of chimpanzees and their habitats, where the destruction of their habitats has been rapacious over the last decades.
Yeah.
And I think this was an incredibly important role. I don't honestly know if there would still be very many wild chimpanzees if she had not spent the last 40, 50 years campaigning on their behalf.
Yeah. In fact, she was a very shy person, actually, right? She really would have just wanted to be in the field. And of course, you've had a chance to meet her. Could you talk a little bit about when was it that you had a chance to meet her, and what was it like to meet Jane?
I think, primatologists are lucky. She was really what we consider the first primatologist, so the leader of our field, somebody who really went in to the forest and spent a lot of time observing animals. And her approach has been adopted not only by primatologists, but by animal behavior, the field of animal behavior in general. And so she was at our conferences quite often, which was wonderful and very inspiring. And the number of people that I've talked to have a similar story to mine, that they have come into this field because of her work. It's impressive, really, that again, beyond primatology into animal behavior and conservation in general. And meeting her in person, I mean, she's a very gentle, humane person, but very clear. And it's an impressive combination that she can create change without attributing blame, right? Yes. So I think, I think we all can learn a lot from her approach.
Going back to some of her early work and her research on the ground, she did give names to a lot of the chimpanzees, like we spoke of earlier. She kind of recognized their individuality, their quirks, personalities. Her observations revealed behaviors that was once thought uniquely human, which was making tools, grieving, that this is something that even, chimpanzees are showing, right? What is it about Jane's work that has most profoundly shaped your understanding of what it means to be human?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think she overturned a number of assumptions about humans. And the one you mentioned, the first one is that for centuries we had been considered, man the toolmaker. Yeah. And she showed that chimpanzees use and make their own tools for food processing, such as fishing for termites. Now we know that there are many other animals that also use tools, but she was the first one to really make, this to break down this barrier, one of the Rubicons, we call them, between what we consider being human, us, and all the other animals. And this idea that we are wrong quite often about what we consider to be human unique features made me realize how human-centric we are, that we naturally think we are the best. And often understanding chimpanzees and other animals is realizing that much of what we think of as human is really much older than our species. For example, our capacity to cooperate, to build friendships, adopting non-kin orphans at a cost to ourselves, all of these things demonstrates something that we considered were human traits, but are not only human traits, and often, in fact, we humans forget to employ them.
Yeah. In fact, I also remember reading that when Jane first told Louis Leakey, her, the person who actually kind of urged her to go and do this research on chimpanzees, he was shocked, about this discovery, right? Because nobody had gone in the field to study chimpanzees, and for someone to say that they use tools was, as a paleoanthropologist who actually studies ancient man making tools and things like that, he was visibly shocked about this, wasn't he?
Yes, he absolutely was, and it was a momentous finding. I think it made people rethink a lot about how we define ourselves as human, and helped hopefully to break down some of the barriers between ourselves and other animals.
Yeah. Neha, you've also spent years observing wildlife across India. Who or what inspired you to pursue this path? You were a journalist previously and then decided to even study, wildlife and wildlife research. What was it that inspired you in this path? And was Jane Goodall at all one of those influences? If so, what aspects of her journey probably resonated with you personally or professionally?
I think as a woman, you get more inspired by women. You get inspired by women who've broken the mold. And though Jane was 91, many of the issues she faced are still relevant today. So, for example, she was not allowed to go inside the forest alone. So she had to take her mother with her because you can't let a single woman go alone. And that's something we still face here in India, where it's very hard to conduct research by yourself. And sometimes, in my own research, I have encountered my field assistant refusing to talk to me initially because he doesn't talk to women. Then you break down the barriers of, sort of the cultural shocks that both of us experience and learn to talk to each other. And then after that, they're very protective in a very different way. So in many ways, you're marked out as different from anybody else because you're a woman in a remote area. So Jane's story resonates not just with me, but I think with many, many women in many different kinds of fields. It's not just for conservation. I think it would be for you as well. Because to be an intrepid woman, to go where maybe women have not gone before, or maybe they have, we don't know about it. But Jane was so eloquent in talking about both the struggles as well as the opportunities that she had. She was very candid about it, and she often spoke about how being perceived as a difficult woman is so easy because any woman who doesn't do what is expected of her is often labeled a difficult woman.
Right.
And as you said, I used to be a journalist, and that's also a very important part of my life because even for women in journalism, it's not easy. Because even in journalism, you end up going to a lot of places where you might be the only woman out there, maybe in the night. There'll be women in that society, but they're not seen to be doing anything outside the sphere of the home. You don't actually see a lot of women in many parts of India even now. So just to be able to hear of a woman who has successfully broken barriers is a great inspiration. And she was definitely one of that. So from her story is definitely the analogy of the Beauty and the Beast, which she also spoke about often, because there's this famous picture of her hand touching the hand of a chimpanzee, and it was like a kind of interspecies kind of communication, and she was a champion of that. She was a champion of talking about her subject with great emotion and with great passion. And also in a world of doom and gloom, we have so many wars raging, we have climate change, we have this policy paralysis. It's also important to talk about the things that are left that are worth saving. And that's something she spoke about very often. And I think environmentalism should not be seen as something that's defeatist. And that came out very strongly in her work. And I think that's something, particularly in the Indian context, because we're a developing economy. We have several challenges in terms of how we want to zone our land. Should it remain a forest or should it become something else, etc. Right? So to find something worth saving and then to say, let us protect this or let us not disturb it is also a very important lesson. And that's definitely something I often lean on what Jane has said when I myself feel a little, bereft of motivation.
Yeah. Now, of course, not all her discoveries were very easy, right? She was also kind of willing to share when she bore witness to darker truths, violence, infanticide, and the so-called 4-year war between two warring chimpanzee factions at Gombe. Now, many may have actually turned away from something like this, but Jane stayed on and she told the story, even when it was so painful. What does this resilience reveal to you about Jane, not only as a scientist, but also as a storyteller? As you mentioned when we started out, she just had this kind of natural flair for telling stories empathetically.
Well, first, again, it demonstrates her commitment to the truth, which is critical for every scientist. And again, shows that she had the natural instincts of a scientist. And second, it again reflects upon our own species, that we often don't like to acknowledge our darker side, and we rather project it onto them, the others, the opposition, the outgroup. But I think what she really showed is that a chimpanzee can, in one moment be empathetic and gentle, and, an hour later in another context be violent. And I think this is also something very human, and again, something we don't often like to acknowledge.
Jane, of course, had done all this research, and then she arrived at Cambridge, to do her PhD. And this was without an undergraduate degree. I was just talking to both my children, one of whom definitely wants to be a scientist. And I was just telling her that, this is why field work is so important, right? It's not about what you're learning in class. You really have to be out there and do research and look at what's going on in the field. When it came to Jane, in the beginning, when she was doing the field work, like you said, they did tell her that she was doing it all wrong, whether it was naming the chimps and kind of giving them human qualities. But she persisted, and in doing so, she really changed what science itself could look like. What is her defiance of convention and her courage to follow her instincts, which is again something we'd started this conversation with. What does that mean to you? And is that something you've carried into your work life?
Yes, I think that's been very influential. Again, the idea of really searching for the truth, making discoveries that nobody else knew about before, like her and the finding out that chimpanzees use tools and humans are not the only tool user. I think this has been a big influence on the way I approach my data collection. So, for example, I think to understand species as complex as chimpanzees, you need to be out there observing them. You cannot do this from data that other people have collected. You cannot do this from reading papers. You need to be out there yourself to be seeing what the animals are doing. And not only that, one of the challenges we have moving through the forest is that it's difficult, right? There are lianas and rocks and logs and
bumps,
cliffs and valleys and all sorts of things. And trying to keep pace with chimpanzees who've been moving through this forest their whole life takes some time. So it's really only after that we've been there for a year or even 2 years that we can move fluidly with them. And that's so crucial to being able to observe them, because what tends to happen is, you're walking with chimpanzees and nothing much is happening. And then you hear a sub-party of chimpanzees ahead, or, there's a food tree ahead. And suddenly the chimpanzees you are with pick up pace and they're off. And then you hear lots of amazing vocalizations and social interactions as the chimpanzees meet the other chimpanzees, or as they approach the food tree and enter the food tree. And then by the time you've caught up with them, everything's gone quiet again and they're just sitting there feeding. So, and until you are able to keep pace with them, you miss a lot of the important information about their societies.
Now, from your experiences in Nagaland and Manipur, elsewhere, why is fieldwork so crucial for women scientists, and what challenges do they face?
So, fieldwork is crucial for any wildlife conservationist, but maybe it can be a bit more important for women, because we're so often told that we can't do it. It sounds like a funny thing to hear, but even now, this is 2025. It's going to get over the year. But even now, we hear all kinds of things when we go out into the field. We are told that, we shouldn't be out in the sun because it will ruin our complexion. We are told that we are going to get into trouble. Somebody is going to kidnap us. Are we going to be able to walk the way the male colleagues walk? Are we going to be able to lift our rucksacks the way the guys do? So, these are very small things, but they do add up if you hear them daily. Nagaland is a bit of it's an exception in the sense that the society is not as close to seeing women in the way other parts of India can be. In other parts of India, it can be really hard to be by yourself, but Nagaland comparatively is an egalitarian society. But there are other challenges. The other challenges in terms of being accepted, you have to kind of, as I said, every context is totally different. And in the Nagaland context, it was important to kind of live there for as long as possible, to stay there every year, and to also understand how important it is to create a project or a program that is culturally appropriate. I think, for me, the most important thing I learn is by sitting and talking to the women as much as is possible. Because oftentimes the experiences of men and women are very different within a community. When we talk about wildlife conservation, or even if we talk about how we plan conservation, the voices of local women are often left out. And it's absolutely important that it should be included. And also to say over here, so many conservationists I've met have actually been local people, tribal people, or just forest dwellers who live in the area, because they already have deeply entrenched ways of living along with nature that are much more sophisticated and much more enlightened than any of us. And therefore, to be able to transcribe some of those learnings into practice is always an ongoing process. And even in Nagaland, this is something that I learned, that we were trying to campaign for the ending the hunting of the Amur falcon, which is a migratory falcon that comes from Nagaland. And so the entire project was actually created by the local people. And because they have a culture and a language of song and dance, they have a culture and language of having skits presented by the community, the main sort of work was done through these skits.
Could you explain, because not everybody would know what an Amur falcon is and why it is important. So could you give a little bit of context over there? And when you say that you'll involve local people, could you also kind of explain, because this is again in connection to, what Jane also did in terms of advocacy later on in her life, which is something you touched upon earlier. So if you could just give some context and also some color about this, that would be great.
Yeah. So the Amur falcon is a small bird of prey that eats insects mainly. It's about the size of a pigeon, and it's a migratory falcon. So it kind of, from Siberia, parts of Russia, it migrates to Nagaland in India at the end of October. It spends about a month there, fattening itself up. And it's basically following the monsoon rains. So after the monsoon, which is October, around this time, they will begin to come. At the end of this month, October, they'll begin to come and they'll eat all the termites and the dragonflies. And then they will kind of fuel up, as in they'll keep eating for about a month's time. And then they'll fly over India, then they'll fly over the Indian Ocean, and then they go to Africa. And then they spend some time over there. And then after that, when winter is over, and it gets a bit warmer in Siberia and in Amur, they kind of fly back over Europe. And in India, because they were coming in very large numbers, they were being hunted in Nagaland. It was mass hunting. It was hunting that had very large numbers. Tens of thousands of birds were being killed every day. And again, it's important to understand here that cultures are different. So the idea is not to vilify a hunting community or to say that this is a hunting community. Communities are not a homogeneous unit, right? So they found a way to hunt the bird or to eat the bird and kill the bird, and they did that. And it is simply a question of rituals or customs being different in different parts of India. So the more we interact with people in ways that are deep and meaningful, the more you realize how similar we all are. So the fact is that we get our food from sort of the market, and we have more commercial ways of getting our food, and some people hunt. And when you have large numbers of migratory birds, it's not just the Amur falcon, there are also many other migratory birds that get hunted in various parts of the world. The issue becomes that if very large numbers are being taken, there's definitely a threat to the global population. And, for example, the passenger pigeon, which was a bird in the United States, was hunted to extinction. Hunting was one of the reasons why the bird became extinct. So just to say that something that's very plentiful today can be extinct tomorrow. So our reason for going in, our reason for engaging on this issue was because we were afraid that the hunting was unsustainable because too many were being taken. And when we started communicating, when we started doing our focus group meetings with the community over there, we realized that it was just another hunt that for them. It was not some evil plan. And, again, we have stereotypes of, a bad hunter. It's really not like that. It's simply a system of taking from the forest or taking from a wetland or taking for nutrition. Sometimes it's for sale. But, there are ways to deal with this that don't end up demonizing the other person.
Yeah.
So
It actually reminds me of Jane's conversations with the medical community, where she kind of spoke to them about not having chimps, to kind of experiment the medicines on.
Yeah.
And it was about her just going there, not going to kind of paint them as villains, but
Yeah.
kind of showing them the chimps in the wild. And she talks about how these scientists didn't know better, and some of them were tearing up looking at the difference in the state of lives of the chimps in their custody and the ones in the wild. So you're right.
Yeah,
about that.
no, absolutely. And I think the main point here is conservation is a social change.
Endeavor.
It's a social endeavor and social change. And you can't do it alone. And you should not even attempt to do it alone. It's not about what I feel and because I've studied the subject, therefore you must listen to what I'm saying. That's a very wrong view of conservation. Conservation is something that we need to arrive some kind of consensus at. We need to find some consensus. And I think with the Amur Falcon issue, one of the most important things we learned is how important it is to let the community drive the program. So, it was a kind of education or advocacy program, but it's not that we went there to get the community arrested. And if anybody feels that that's the way it should be done, I think they should relook at the Amur Falcon project and see how it takes longer to find consensus, and consensus can also be very shaky. But it's definitely something that is the most sustainable.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'm also saying that when you're talking about a bird that's, threatened, or an animal that's threatened, whether it's a chimpanzee or whether it's a bird, the issue is, do other people hold the same value as you do? And oftentimes they don't. So Jane Goodall studied chimps, and, I've studied the Amur Falcon. But maybe the next person doesn't see it the way that I do. So therefore it becomes my job to communicate why it is a valuable thing.
Another interesting aspect of Jane's life is how she moved from research to activism. She at first did it reluctantly, and then she kind of felt that this was what she needed to do, and she just couldn't be happy observing chimps in the forest, but she really needed to do a lot to actually kind of safeguard their habitat. I think there was a time where she had a chance to fly above Gombe a few years later, when after she had done her research, and she was shocked to find that many of the hilltops had gone barren, and that was really kind of a turning point for her to make these changes. But at the same time, she didn't really kind of engage in the blame game. In fact, she did talk to oil companies. She did approach medical research labs that were, keeping chimps for, experiments, medical experiments. She approached them and she spoke to them. And actually, in some cases, went out and presented to doctors and people who were conducting these experiments and moved them to tears. Could you talk a little bit about this? And is this very different from what researchers actually want to do? Or is this something that is definitely going to be something that all researchers who are looking at, wildlife, that they have to do? First, if you could talk about Jane herself and whether this is something that you would do as a researcher.
Yes, I mean, and unfortunately, there are three massively different and time-consuming domains, right? So science is a over full-time occupation. So is conservation and looking, conducting research to get evidence-based conservation, and activism to raise awareness in public domains and all of the domains that you just spoke of. So all of these are three, more than full-time professions in and of themselves. And of course, one needs to choose which one to go for. One can do a little bit of each, but really one has to focus on one. And in spite of her phenomenal fame, her ability to connect with people, and all the activism that she has done over 40 decades, in spite of that, and of the other giants like her, like Christoph Busch, chimpanzees in the wild remain critically endangered, as do their habitats. And we need to continue their work somehow now that they're not here. And, this is something we need to continue. One thing that you spoke of earlier is hope, that she always talked of hope, and we need to keep hopeful. Hope is critical, but so is action, and we need to keep both of those together.
Yeah. In fact, that was one of the reasons why she decided to not just talk to world leaders and people, who were kind of maybe conducting experiments on chimps or, trading chimps, but also was, really kind of talking to children. That was one reason why she felt that this was a group of people who were going to grow up and become policymakers and perhaps environmentalists and wildlife researchers. And she worked a lot with children, right? I mean, traveling almost 300 days in a year. This is something she often mentioned, even when she was, as recent as now. I mean, I think she passed away while she was getting ready, the next day to give a speech in one of these conferences.
Absolutely. And her work has been tremendous. And she has influenced all the people you just said across 2 generations. I mean, it's phenomenal. Yeah. The legacy is phenomenal.
Yeah. Now, Catherine, the most personal question, I wanted to ask you was, if you imagine Jane sitting beside you now, not as the legend we all know, but as a fellow traveler, someone whose life has touched yours, what would you say to her?
I would say, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Jane. I would also say, in chimpanzee.
I would like her to recount her darkest moments and tell me how she got out of it. How do you overcome, despair, or how do you overcome a dark time? I would just want to know, and I'm sure she would have a very simple answer for that. And I think sometimes those very simple, short answers are the best.
Thank you very much, Neha and Catherine, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.